If a bouquet of flowers arrives at our door, we're often more interested in who sent them. Yet the Victorians were more concerned with what it meant. The Victorian language of flowers, also known as floriography, was a way to send messages using specific plants and flowers. Combining different flowers allowed them to send more complex or sophisticated messages. And of course, one of the reasons why this language proved so popular was because of the strict set of codes that dictated behaviour. Of course, it didn't necessarily mean that you were only sending positive messages, because orange lilies meant both "you are proud" and "I hate you." That said, the Victorians were nothing if not innovative, and the language of flowers became a way to pass messages in a subtle, discreet way. And I thought it might be quite fun to actually explore a little bit more about what the language is and where it came from, and even how it developed and how you can use it in the 21st century in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. This is the first episode of March, although it did feel a little bit weird even deciding to do the episode, I guess with everything that's going on right now, and it did seem somewhat frivolous to be talking about the Victorian language of flowers when one country has invaded another. That said, I do recognise the need to decompress rather than disengage entirely if we're to continue to offer aid or support, so if this episode allows you the breathing space to do so, then good. You will notice that I have removed the links to buy me a coffee to support Fabulous Folklore in the show notes, and I instead encourage you to visit the links there to help provide support to humanitarian organisations working in both Ukraine and Afghanistan, because folklore, after all, is the accumulated knowledge of the people. And a lot of people in various places around the world do need our protection at the moment. So with all that being said, I suppose it's time to jump into the episode. And like I say, we are looking at the Victorian language of flowers this week. And it's interesting because I have seen some people refer to it in the past as a secret language. But I would actually dispute this, because if people could access entire lists of flower meanings, then exactly how secret can it actually be? Now, it does become a lot more important as a way to say something without saying it aloud or in writing. So I think in some ways I actually think that floriography is a little bit more of a set of gestures than a language. But as I say, we are going to have a look at where it came from, how it developed and how you can use it in the 21st century. Now, it is difficult to pinpoint a specific creator because flower meanings have shifted over time and between countries, and no one sat down and decided to just invent a language based on these meanings. Now, where the Victorians are concerned, while not its creator, a key figure in the development of floriography was Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, and she was the wife of the British ambassador in Turkey, and she lived there in the early 1700s, so well before the Victorians, but she does really lay the groundwork for what was going to come later. And she wrote letters home about the practice of salam, and according to her, this was a way the harem ladies could pass secret messages to their lovers. Rather than sending notes, which could obviously be intercepted, they sent flowers as part of this language. Or did they? Many people have since noted that salam was actually a rhyming game, not a secret flower language, and Montagu either misunderstood what it was or she romanticised it for her readers. Thus, she talked over the people who actually practiced it and just took the bits that worked for her. Obviously, history is littered with examples of a story making a better option than the truth, but the publication of her embassy letters caught the public imagination, and they seized on the idea of sending messages using flowers, especially given its, as they considered it, exotic origins. Now, Romy Stott actually explains that there was already a fashion in France in the early 1800s to use flower almanacs, and these combined images of seasonal flowers with facts or poems. The new flower dictionaries that then appeared in 1810 were essentially appendices to these almanacs. Publishers began printing flower dictionaries, notably one by Louise Cortambert, writing as Madame Charlotte de la Tour in 1819. And in Les Languages des Fleurs, obviously French is not my strong point, I do apologise, Cortambert notes that, and I quote, "the language of flowers was known to the ancients," end quote, and suggests that the Greeks sent secret messages through flowers. And she was the one who also continued the belief in Eastern practices of flowers used as love notes. However, Cortambert added an extra element, saying that, and I quote, "the significations of the different flowers are changed," end quote, to help keep the messages secret. Some of the meanings came from observations about the plants, such as the snowdrop representing hope, since it is the first plant to break free of the snow in winter. More meanings came from the legends and lore surrounding the flowers. So, for example, sweet violets meant modesty, after the myth in which the god Apollo pursued one of Diana's nymph friends, so the goddess turned her into a violet to preserve her virtue. Other meanings came from the plant's medicinal properties, such as pennyroyal meaning "you must leave" in the language, which came from its use as an abortifacient. Now, some of this came from an old medicinal idea known as the doctrine of signatures, and this held true that a plant looked like the part of the body it was supposed to help, and it was the idea that God had left his signature on a plant so we would know what it was for. So, for example, in the language of flowers, walnuts represent intellect, and of course they were also believed to represent the brain because they look a bit like a brain. And then you also have my favourite example, which is lungwort, which is from Pulmonaria, and the leaves look a little bit like diseased lungs, so they believed it would help the lungs. Apparently it doesn't, but there we go. Now, sometimes the meanings make sense, like these ones, or indeed poppies represent sleep, referring to the plant's soporific qualities, but Cortambert then says that poppies represent consolation, which is an interesting link. And then other dictionaries followed, many adding illustrations to the books. So Routledge published The Illustrated Language of Flowers, compiled by Mrs. L. Burke in 1856, and this dictionary works both ways. So the first half features flowers and their associated meanings, while the second half lists common messages and the associated flowers. So this makes it easier to decide what flowers to send or to decode the message. Now, according to Patricia Telesco, most people consulted a book by Miss Carruthers of Inverness from 1879. Now, Telesco doesn't actually name the book, but a swift Google search revealed it to be Flower Lore, The Teachings of Flowers, Historical, Legendary, Poetical and Symbolical by Miss Carruthers, not Carruthers. Now, her book is an impressive compendium of flower folklore, combining more in-depth articles about the flowers with a dictionary at the back, and each flower comes with its established keyword along with its lore, which in many ways kind of explains why Telesco then went on to make the Victorian Flower Oracle, to show how you could actually make your own oracle deck using flowers and the Victorian language of flowers. Now, Telesco does make a good point that the language of flowers doesn't actually just contain flowers, because it also contains trees, moss, vines and various other plants. Now, this obviously gave people a much larger range of botanical content for their messages. So it's a good job that wealthy Victorians could take advantage of new industrial developments to create hothouses, which allowed them to grow all manner of botanical beauties. Yet Telesco also says that the scent of the flowers alone could communicate a message, and she gives the example of a young woman dropping a handkerchief scented with violet to tell a would-be lover that her admiration would be unwavering. Obviously nowadays we just tweet people. But as Teresa Dietz points out, there's a fundamental flaw with floriography, because given the wide array of meanings for different flowers, it was crucial that both recipient and sender used the same flower dictionary, because you can only imagine the high dudgeon that people would get into if they had a look and thought, hang on, this person's insulting me, and it was actually supposed to be a compliment. But if they used different books, they could, in theory, come up with different meanings. Now, floriography also became a way to add symbolism to artistic creations, so flowers mentioned in novels took on a new significance, which is sometimes lost on modern readers. So as an example, in Jane Eyre, Charlotte Brontë used the list of flowers to help underpin Jane's feelings. So, for example, as her time at the awful Lowood School draws to a close, Brontë describes how, and I quote, "flowers peeped out amongst the leaves, snowdrops, crocuses, purple auriculas and golden-eyed pansies," end quote. Now, according to the language of flowers, the snowdrops represent hope, the crocuses represent youthful gladness, and the pansies represent thoughts. And it is a bit of an odd one, because Mrs. Burke's dictionary says that the auricula meant painting, which does make it a little bit of an odd one out there. But speaking of painting, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, the group of artists who reached back to the apparent purity of art before Raphael, and about whom there's an entire theme from last year when I looked at the myth and lore in Pre-Raphaelite paintings, they added extra messages to their paintings by including specific flowers in the composition. So, for example, in Frederick Sandy's painting Vivian, he includes Daphne, which represents coquetry and the desire to please, but its toxicity actually reflects the dangerous femininity of Vivian herself. And again, such meanings may be lost on the modern viewer, but they do add a depth to the paintings that can be fun to unravel. So how do you actually send a message using flowers? Well, like I say, it all comes down to the meanings, which are what makes floriography so exciting and complicated in equal measure. So I might want to tell someone I need my own space, but I'm sad about this. So I might mix heath for solitude with yew for sorrow. Although I could also send mean messages with plants like hortensia, which means you are cold, sweet-scented tussilage, which means justice shall be done to you, or wild tansy, which means I declare war against you. Now, senders had to be mindful of both the meaning of each flower and its position in an arrangement, and the colour of the flower also affected the content of the message. So, as an example, a purple iris meant you are beautiful, as well as conveying wisdom, but a yellow iris meant passion. So choosing the right flower, the right colour and the right placement was how you wrote a sentence. Not only that, but some flowers had multiple meanings. Samantha Gray gives the example that white lilies meant virginity, majesty and purity. Now, how exactly could you be sure that you sent the right message? Well, the recipient needed to look at each flower in the arrangement to work out the bouquet's context. Only then did the meaning become clear. Plus, as Dietz pointed out earlier, you needed to be sure you had the same meanings dictionary. Now, consulting Mrs. Burke's volume does make the flower choice slightly easier in this case, because she states that it's the imperial lily that means majesty, while the white lily represents purity. So getting specific was clearly beneficial. Now, a casual browse of the flowers available in the Victorian dictionaries is fairly mind-boggling, since a lot of the plants are unfamiliar today, and the decline of the Victorian hothouse no doubt contributes to this issue, but it does also make it a bit difficult to make up a bouquet using interflora because they don't sell mandrake. But even the manner in which flowers were handed over passed on a message. So if you handed the flowers with the right hand, your answer was yes, and the left hand meant no. And even the ribbon was relevant, so the symbolism referred to the giver when tied to the left, and to the recipient when tied to the right. So I suppose that would be quite a good way of making sure that your message was actually understood as you had intended it to be. So what actually happened to the language of flowers? Well, the outbreak of the First World War largely consigned floriography to history because it was really time-consuming and expensive to cultivate the flowers, and essentially warfare required the resources to be used on more helpful things than simply growing plants. Obviously, over time, as social codes relaxed, the need to send secret messages largely disappeared. That said, English Heritage do point out that there's actually little evidence anyone sent messages using the flowers. It's their theory that sort of young genteel women used it a little bit more as a parlour game than an actual language. Now, clearly the Victorians weren't the first to make associations between flowers and concepts, because magical and astrological texts associate plants with spirits and deities. So, for example, William Lilly associated the planet Mars with nettles, brambles, ginger and hemlock, among other herbs, and he linked Jupiter with betony, lungwort, marjoram and violets. And obviously I do have episodes on some of those plants and indeed Mars and Jupiter in the backlist. But either way, the language of flowers is still a fun way to show people what you're really thinking, or indeed how you feel, even if the recipient never actually grasps the message. Now, I should point out that you might be sending an unintended message if you send flowers without really being aware of what the meaning of those flowers is. Now, I was once given a bouquet of deep red crimson roses, and now while red roses mean I love you, which was the meaning I had hoped for at the time, dark red roses are actually a sign of mourning, and the sender did break up with me 2 months later. A better use of language of flowers is actually gardening, I think, and you can then essentially use flower meanings to help send a message through what you plant in your garden. And of course, what's quite fun with that is if you have any awareness of seasonal planting, which I'm still a little bit lost on, you could actually then, in theory, have a whole wave of messages throughout the year based on what comes up and when. And finally, I just want to leave you with these last examples, because like I said earlier, the snowdrop meant hope, as did the hawthorn. Live oak, which is also known as evergreen oak, meant liberty, and the water willow meant freedom. And I think these are concepts that we all realise are incredibly important. So I hope you enjoyed that particular episode. I would love to know if anyone's ever actually done a language of flowers garden. That would be really cool if you had. So if you have, please do feel free to let me know, and particularly if there's pictures. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed that. We are going to be having a look at something very different next week, which is going to be the development of the poison garden. And this was inspired by a trip of mine many years ago to the poison garden at Alnwick Garden in Northumberland. And we're going to have a look at how they basically developed out of the apothecary garden and things like that. So it's some of the legends and lore and whatnot associated with the plants, but also kind of how these spaces came into being in the first place. So I hope that you enjoy that. And then we're going to round out the month with some nice plants, including lavender. So I hope you enjoy that as well. So anyway, without any further ado, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I do hope that you come back and join me next week. And more importantly, I hope that you do manage to stay healthy, happy and safe wherever you are. Cheerio! Well, thank you for listening and thanks for visiting Fabulous Folklore. I hope you enjoyed your stay. If you did, why not consider subscribing in your podcast app of choice? If you enjoy the show, why not leave me a review and help other listeners to find it as well? And if you'd like bonus exclusive episodes of the podcast, then why not support me on Patreon? It does help me to keep the show going and it means that you get a little bit extra every month as well. And you can find all of the necessary links in the show notes below. So without any further ado, I will bid you adieu and I hope that you have safe travels wherever you're going on to next.